Well, welcome everyone to the Primary Sources in Teaching Online webinar series, brought to you by the Teaching with Primary Sources Western Region at the Metropolitan State University of Denver, in partnership again with the TPS Teachers Network. I'm Keith Patterson. I'm the Associate Director of the TPS Western Region, and I will be your host tonight. Along with me is Kyle Clayball and Crystal Payne. They'll be helping in the chat. Please reach out to them if you have any questions or comments. For those who would like a professional development certificate for your participation tonight, we'll provide a link at the end to fill out where you can fill out a brief reflection and just let us know where to send that certificate. Our two-part program tonight is entitled Curating Primary Sources for Online Learning, and it'll be presented by the TPS Teachers Network Coordinator, Mary Johnson, and there'll be a little bit of help from myself and Kyle Kleba towards the end. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Keith. I just wanted to show, because we've been doing a number of webinars, I wanted to show you, let me get started here with my mouse, who's behind the scenes here in all of these webinars. So this is our TPS Teachers Network admin team. And I know that we're often behind the scenes and you don't probably have an image of us. So here we are. Vivian's the program manager. I'm the coordinator. Peggy O'Neill-Jones is the Executive Director of the TPS Western Region, and her staff is Kyle, Keith, and Crystal. If you have never heard of or never joined or are curious about the TPS Teachers Network, much of what we do tonight will be starting with the TPS Teachers Network. So I wanted to provide you a quick link here that you could register with. Just tpsteachersnetwork.org/register. I won't talk much about the network, but you will definitely see it in action. And this is what we hope to accomplish tonight. You've already probably seen the box on the left, but what we'd like to do in part one is just to talk very briefly about this idea that we're testing of sparking your album. So using Adobe Spark to enhance, make beautiful albums that start with the TPS Teachers Network. And then what I'd like to do is take you through some of the considerations that we go through when we're selecting primary sources. And to do that, I'm just going to take you right on the ground with a tour through the thought process that I went through in creating an album in the TPS Teachers Network. I think I started Monday. And then I'll show you very briefly how to upload one primary source to an album. And at that point, in part two, Keith and Kyle will take over. Kyle's going to actually show you what my album that I've taken you through will look like, or does look like, in Adobe Spark. And then he'll talk more about some of the technology behind adapting and exporting your album to Spark, and actually adding items to Spark, and show you how that all works out. So first part is more about collection and curation. Second part is more technical, and that's why I'm glad to turn it over to other people. First, I wanted to show you, though, what we actually have a number of options for exporting albums from the TPS Teachers Network. So very briefly, I'm going to show you what these look like. The first one is an album called Kids in School, and this is what it looks like in the TPS Teachers Network. Oops, sorry, I can't do that. I'm going to have to get out of this. Pardon me while I take you to another place. So this album, Kids in School, was created by a TPS consortium member from Minnesota. And this is what an album looks like in the network itself. So this is what we see all the time in the network. This is an album of all Kids in School pictures. You can see that there are some comments possible, some downloads, and so on. So that is the basic album in the network. If you use the shareable URL from that album in the network, this is what you see. This is one of the export options, but this allows you to share your albums outside the network with students, with parents, with colleagues, in workshops, and so on. And you can see that it displays differently because we've stripped out all of the personally identifiable information. But it's still the album one item at a time. And you can see there are all sorts of links and references. So as I scroll down, you'll see that you can expand any item, and you can see the entire data, information, all of that comes in automatically whenever you import a Library of Congress primary source. I also wanted to show you that you can click on the plus sign to view anything larger. And so this actually can become a way of presenting. And for students also, they can zoom in on these from this exported version of the album. And then the third one is what we'll be showing you today, which is this same album, but in Spark. And it's just so pretty. So this is the album, the same one, same items, kids in school. Each of these is clickable, and you have all sorts of options, which you'll see in the second half hour of this presentation. You'll notice that this is a basic album, so lots of great primary sources, but not much as far as notes, as far as teaching ideas. And so that's one of our purposes tonight, is to show you how that can add to a Spark album. I'm going to go from this screen to the next album and show you one more. This is one that did include teaching notes. And it came from Sarah Westbrook, who works with the Right Question Institute. It was her very first album. So this is to show you that it's relatively easy to create an album in the network. She had never done it before. She was not particularly comfortable in the network at that point, brand new user, but she was excited about the possibilities of creating an album in the network that could be used with the question formulation technique. So this is her basic album. You can see that she has not all Library of Congress resources, and that's often you'll see a link here when you're using secondary sources in this album. There are a couple of these from the Smithsonian and another from a presidential library, and these two items here with the images are from the Library of Congress. Again, from the shareable URL, this is what that album looks like. And this can be exported outside of the network into social media, into Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, and again, you can click on the plus sign to make an image big. So that's from the network, the shareable URL. And then the third way that we're going to talk about tonight is converting all of this using Adobe Spark. And you can see this looks different from just the collection of primary sources because it scrolls the teaching ideas over the images, which is a really lovely way to do a presentation and to interest kids and to share what you know about teaching with this album. So these are all teaching ideas that Sarah shared, that she actually entered into the album as she was creating it. So you see we're working in a progression here from an album in the network to an album using the shareable URL outside the network to an album converted into Spark. Okay, I told you I was going to switch then to some considerations for selection. I've put two primary sources up for you to peruse. I'm going to give you just 30 seconds to look at these two suffrage-related primary sources. I especially like the poem. These two sources might not be good to be used for certain age levels, but one of the big considerations, big, I think the most important one is considering who your students are. So what is their age? What is their reading level? How mature are they? How immature are they? How much prior knowledge do they have? Do they have historical primary knowledge? prior knowledge? Do they have some needs regarding vocabulary? I would suggest that if you use the poem on the right, even a portion of it, you'll need to consider vocabulary needs. How is their online attention span if you're presenting all of this online? And what are their interests? What personal connections could they make? I don't think there's any one-size-fits-all primary source. And so knowing your students really, first and foremost, most important thing. I've learned a lot from the Library of Congress and some of the writing that they've done about considerations for selection. Here's one that I think has stood the test of time from the Library of Congress. It was an article in a TPS quarterly, and it was just for elementary, but it gave some ideas about at what grade level you should introduce certain types of primary sources and what strategies you could use for introducing those primary sources. There are many, many other considerations in selection too. I've put a few of them on this screen. I realize it's kind of heavy with information. I've learned a lot from Tom Bober, who is a TPS Teachers Network mentor and a former teacher in residence at the Library of Congress. He wrote some articles for the teachers blog, and you can see the link there, or the URL for the teachers blog. It's called Teaching with the Library of Congress. The header's down there at the bottom. It's a footer for my slide. So when are you going to use it? Where are you going to use it? To start a lesson? Do you need a primary source for independent learning, for differentiation? Do you need a more complex primary source for deeper analysis? Are you using a primary source for enrichment? Or do you need to use it at a moment where you need to activate background knowledge? So all of those are moments of use. Where, when, and why would you choose a particular primary source or sources for your students? As far as supporting student resource, do you want a primary source that helps students launch their investigations? Or do you want to control the shape and direction of the research? One of my favorite ever techniques is to use the question formulation technique. There was a wonderful webinar on that last night to get students to generate their own questions. And then always consider your teaching goals. Is your teaching goal to have students understand different perspectives? Are you working on evidence-based argumentation? Maybe you'd like them to compare a primary source to a current event. And what is your goal as a teacher? Do you want your students to do geographic thinking? Is it related to STEM, vocabulary building, media literacy, music and art? So many wonderful sources for music and art. Historical novels, maybe that's what you're teaching. Culturally relevant pedagogy, political elections, on and on and on and on. Again, I highly recommend the teacher's blog for all sorts of ideas. You can do a search on selection. You can do a search on, well, honestly, every blog post from the Library of Congress teachers blog has many of these considerations for selection included, and they've already applied those considerations to their selections in those blog posts. So I made this brand new album, and I titled it Social Distancing. This is the one I made this week. So I'm going to take you through my thought process. And as I take you through the thought process, I would like you to consider these questions. Who are my students? What are my teaching goals? When and where will I use this collection of primary sources? How can I support student research with this collection? What ideas do I have? And I would love for you to put your ideas as I go through this process into the chat. I think we can learn a lot from each other. So I'm going to move now to the actual album. If I can find it in all my clutter. Let me just open it here. And you're going to be looking at the album in the network. So let me enlarge that. Get so many tabs going. I'm sure nobody has that problem. All right, this is the album on social distancing. When I created this album, I wrote a description of the album, and that's something that almost everybody does because that's like the first text box that comes up. So I wanted to explore social distancing through primary sources so that students could compare and contrast them to today and all of what's going on with social distancing today. And there are so many directions you can go with these, and I'll just go through a few. The very first item I chose was this one. It's very old. It's from 1799. And when I first started this, I thought, what do I even search on at the Library of Congress? How do I find anything about social distancing? That's such a modern term. In fact, I would propose that it probably will become the word of the year for 2020, but I could be wrong. And so one of the things I do when I start searching is try to start thinking historically and start thinking not like a Google searcher, but someone who's looking for historical documents. And I have to come up with different keywords. So I started with stay away. I just put stay away in the search in the Library of Congress. And this is what came up. So, and then in my teaching notes, I wrote some ideas for how you would use this or what questions you would ask. In this one, why would a peasant want to keep a village lawyer at a distance? And does that really matter? Well, no, but I'm really talking about why when you're on a walk and someone comes much closer than 6 feet from you, what do? Do you use a pitchfork? Do you wear a mask? I think this would work really well for early elementary. Just to start the discussions about social distancing. The next one's more complicated. The title of this primary source was The Matinee Line is a Study in Democracy. Well, why? How is a matinee line? Okay, vocabulary, what in the world is a matinee? Why are the people standing so close? Are they standing 6 feet apart? No. What's different? Can you think of a recent event in the news when citizens had to leave their homes and risk getting COVID-19 to vote in a state election? What would you have done in that situation? Would you have stood this close? So lots of deeper discussions are possible from a primary source like this. And another thing that I've noticed is that you see a lot of pictures taken of streets and cities with almost nobody in them. I've seen flyovers of Florence, Italy, for example, with one person in a piazza that normally have thousands. This is a stereograph picture, and it is of New York, obviously. You could, I suggest in the teaching notes that you could have students look for those pictures that they've seen in social media today to compare photographs from history, from primary sources, with photographs from today that, that represent social distancing. Move quickly forward. This one has a strange name, the stereograph as an educator. Well, okay, is this stay-at-home learning? What's a stereograph? Students today are using a variety of technologies at home. What are those technologies? Keith, Kyle, please interrupt me if you see questions in the chat that I should respond to. You're welcome to anytime.
So far, no questions, so I guess proceed and I'll pipe in if needed.
Okay, sounds good. One thing that I also try to do when I'm creating an album in the TPS Teachers Network is to find some kind of personal connection. And in this case, I did find a personal connection. I went digging for something that I knew was in my house, and that was an actual stereograph. So this is one that belonged to my husband's grandmother. And if you can somehow, if you've got students who can find artifacts, or if you have artifacts, this is something I always look for, always some kind of personal connection. This one really does end up applying. The particular card that went into this stereograph has a baby at a window waving goodbye and saying bye-bye, Papa. So something like this could be used to spark a discussion about concerns of your students whose parents leave home every day for work because they work in essential services. Also, there have been a lot of photographs of people in windows as well, who are socially isolating. So there are possibilities there. I wanted to point out too, right up here at the end of the teaching notes, you see 2 tags, and something that we encourage people who create albums in the network to do is to add those tags. There are custom tags always available. There are also grade level tags and content area tags. And this just allows other people in the network to search on those tags and find good content for their particular situations. Okay, let's move quickly along now. I really, really encourage people to look for odd, different, not traditional photographic primary sources. And that might be newspaper articles from Chronicling America. It might be audio files. There are a lot of films in the Library of Congress, a lot of artwork in the Library of Congress. So I was, again, working through my thought process, working through my keyword possibilities. I went from stay away to stay home to loneliness to isolation to alone. And I came up with an audio file, a song written by Irving Berlin. And I learned something. What I learned here was that anything from National Jukebox, which is a service of the Library of Congress, but owned by Sony, you have to actually go to the site. So you can't play that directly from the network, but you can click on the link to go beyond the network. You have to add it to your playlist, which I've already done. And I want you to think, as I play a short portion of this, how you might use this, and put it in the chat. How might you use this all alone song to talk to your students about social distancing?
Just like a melody that lingers on, you seem to haunt me night and day. I never realized till you had gone how much I cared about you. I can't live without you. All alone, I'm so all alone. There is no one else but you. All alone by the telephone, waiting for a ring, a ting, a ring.
So what do you think? Let me get back to my album here. What is it like to be all alone? How are your students dealing with being all alone? Are they seeing their friends? Are they sad? Lots of empathetic discussions could come from something like this. And I wanted to recommend also that we had an earlier webinar on listening skills, and I've put the links to the recordings of those of that webinar into the teaching notes, so that if you wanted to learn more about listening skills and how you could use an item like this in your classroom, that's a good place to go. Almost done with these. As I mentioned, I always try to pull in something from a newspaper. This one I think is just amazing. It's from the quarantine of 1918 with the 1918 influenza epidemic. And this is a newspaper announcement from the Pullman Herald, which is in Washington, the state of Washington. I'm going to give you a few seconds to read that. I think we're all looking for the end. We'd like to see our towns the same busy, happy little city she was before this awful epidemic struck us. But consider how you would use these suggestions in your classes today, because people are starting to go back to work. Some quarantines are being lifted. And this is a very different approach than what we're hearing today. Another reason I really like to use historic newspapers is that you can learn so much contextually from the articles that are around the article that you're zooming in on, that you're actually using in your class. If you notice, this newspaper went out November 15th, 1918. That's 4 days after the armistice. And there's an article on the left about 2 Pullman soldiers who were killed right at the end. Also a rich possibility for discussion. And I guess my final one is I did a search on isolation, and I found an isolation ward, a hospital that was set up on Ellis Island for sick people with serious contagious diseases. So this would make a good comparison. By the way, I also try often to get something from the Habs collections at the Library of Congress. Those are all architectural drawings and such, very rich in history, if you can find anything there. So my tags for this one were isolation ward, quarantine, and Ellis Island. Okay, let me go back. And I want to, I want to show you, I am going to stay here. I want to show you how very quickly you can add another item to an album. So I'm at the item level. I'm going to go back to the social distancing album here. This is again the album. It has 9 items, and I would like to add one more. So I click at the bottom on Add Media. And in this case, I already have a selection, if I can find it in all of my links. I think it's this one. I kept looking and I thought, what about food lines, and what about social distancing in food lines? And I found this image. I'm going to enlarge it for you so you can see better what it looks like. It is applicants for Red Cross food orders, and instead of standing in line, they're spending their time singing because it's a long wait. How does this compare to the lines that you're seeing today? So this might be a good possibility for an item in the album. What I do is I always go to the About This Item page right here. You see About This Item. I don't enlarge the picture. I need the URL from this basic item page. So I'm going to go up here and copy the URL. And then I go back to my Add an Item, and I simply paste the URL right in here. Insert URL. I'll add that media. Are you following me? It's there. I normally choose the largest option, which is right here. And right here is where I would fill in the teaching notes. So I'll just do this quickly. How would this image of waiting for food compare 2 images from today? That's a very basic question. It's not really a teaching idea, but it will get me started. I could add a tag. Won't do that now for lack of time, but I'm going to upload that item. It was saved, and it has now become a part of my album with the teaching note, the simple teaching note that I put in. And if you go back to the full album, you'll see it's been added at the bottom. It's that simple. Okay, let's go back now to the slide presentation. And I think we're ready for a short break. Keith?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. That was great. Just as a reminder, for those who would like a professional development certificate for participation, the link is there on the screen. It's the bit.ly/PS Teaching Online. If you go to that link, you just fill out a quick survey and just give us some information about where you would like that sent, and we'll get that out to you as soon as we can.